The Chinese economy is built on coercion. China uses trade, investment, market access as means of coercion, as tools. It always has done it, and it always will do. An analyst once said to me in Beijing, likened Chinese statistics to one of the greatest works of contemporary Chinese fiction. The problem is they're political, they're not economic.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today we'll be discussing China's troubled economy with Ian Williams, who is a writer and journalist who has spent 20 years working in and around China as a foreign correspondent for Channel 4 News and NBC. He is also the author of this book, The Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy, which has been described by Chris Patton as a penetrating and chilling account of how China's rise to global dominance has been checked. Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. What are the issues facing China's economy today?
I think they face multiple issues. The dynamics, the reasons for this heady growth over the last 4 decades no longer exist. It's unsustainable. If you look at what's driven China's growth so far, property, where the bubble has now burst, large investment and quite wasteful investment in infrastructure, cheap exports. These are all factors which cannot be sustained. Even Chinese economists recognize this, that the economy needs to be shifted to a different sort of dynamic, to a different sort of model, one that is driven more by genuine innovation, one that relies more on the market, one that relies more on consumers. But the issue is whether under Xi Jinping, with his obsession with control, with security, whether he is capable of making that transition that would make the economy sustainable going forward. I doubt it. I think as long as he is in charge and those obsessions prevail, I'm not optimistic about China's economy being able to make that transition away from what is now an unsustainable model. And the stresses and strains are everywhere. The property crisis continues. There is soaring levels of youth unemployment. It's very publicly, China, particularly in recent months, in the light of Trump's tariffs, etc., is trying to portray a picture of itself as being resilient, as being technologically extremely strong. That is not without some foundation, but I don't think it's enough to make this transition. And I think the noises we're hearing from Xi Jinping trying to remodel himself, remake himself, shift the perception about China, I don't buy it at all. So the notion of rise and fall, to me, is about this economic model being unsustainable and the inability of China's current leadership to be able to make the transition to an economy which will be anywhere near the sort of growth rates, which you're simply not going to get anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up that point on growth. Now, if I were a CCP official, I would probably now say, oh, well, China's growth is still at GDP growth is still at 5%. Now, you have a chapter in your book titled Lies, Damn Lies and Communist Party Statistics. What are the issues with these official figures on growth?
There are multiple issues. I remember an analyst once said to me in Beijing, likened Chinese statistics to one of the greatest works of contemporary Chinese fiction. The problem is they're political. They're not economic. It's always been the case that analysts, particularly some of the sharper, more innovative analysts who were based in Shanghai, would have multiple ways to try and determine what was going on in the Chinese economy because they didn't trust the statistics. This included sending spies down to Shanghai port to count the number of trucks going through, looking at the revenues at Disneyland as a proxy for consumption. Others looked at satellite photographs of the amount of light, electricity consumption over China over a number of years in order to try and get a sense of what was going on. Even China's own leaders didn't trust their own statistics and had their own mechanisms to look at whether it was trains or electricity consumption to try and understand what was going on. More recently, it's become even more difficult because China has clamped down on Western due diligence companies. These are companies which provided information about the market, about partners, about what was going on more generally, independent information, because companies couldn't trust official sources. They've been clamped down upon. We've seen Chinese economists punished for criticizing Xi Jinping's economic management. Before Christmas, one leading economist disappeared, at least from his online activities, after suggesting growth rates were more like 2% over recent years instead of the heady rates of growth that have been claimed. Last year, economists at one of the leading think tanks in Beijing were disciplined for private remarks they made on a social media group about Xi's economic management. He's effectively criminalised pessimism. The Ministry of Public Security, the main espionage bureau, essentially says that pessimism about the Chinese economy is a foreign conspiracy. So for all these reasons, it's become extremely difficult to measure what is really going on in the economy. And of course, when people are making decisions about investment, about the market, about trade, you rely on data, you rely on reliable data, and increasingly that's just not available from China.
Yeah. Do you think there is reliable data even available to Xi Jinping or senior officials in the Communist Party? Do you think they're aware that growth is significantly lower than the official statistics?
I think they're aware, but at the same time, those statistics are political. They are essentially about making a statement to Chinese people and to the world about the resilience of the Chinese economy. They don't trust local officials. They don't trust the bodies regionally which are charged with providing statistics to the center because they are incentivized to hit growth targets. There is an incentive for fraud, for distortion, for the debasement of statistics. It's built into the system. And I think economists recognize that and have developed their own way to try and gauge what's going on. And I think the center is aware of that, but that doesn't mean that they're particularly prepared to either admit to the fallibility of their statistics or do very much about it.
Yeah. So, okay, we've got a sense that China's economy is not growing nearly as fast as it has over the last 30 to 40 years. But perhaps we could get a bit more into what was driving growth before, say, the last 10 years. So you mentioned infrastructure and property. Why were these such important aspects of Chinese growth in, say, the noughties and 2010s?
Well, it was state-led. It was the state throwing money at the economy. Property is a prime example because there was debt at every level in the property structure. You had an absurd system whereby at one point property accounted for, by some estimates, about a third of the economy if you included add-on services that rely on the building. It was driven by speculation. Local governments relied on selling land to property developers for their own income after quite frequently kicking farmers off the land because they didn't have a right to it. They could lease it, but still they don't own it. So you have this merry-go-round of debt, this absurdity of local governments depending on their income in selling land to developers. Developers then selling land onto buyers who were investing in multiple properties. And it was just a speculative bubble, but it was one that was ignored for many, many years until the Communist Party tried to start to deflate the bubble.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult when you've got a bubble of that size.
Yeah.
And although there have been actions taken to try and, you sometimes get the sense as a party thinking, give me my bubble back, because property was such an important driving force in the economy. But still property prices are falling, still property purchases are declining. And of course, this has a huge knock-on effect on confidence, because you can't then turn around and say to consumers, spend. We want to shift this economy, because the share of the economy in China, which is dedicated to consumption, is extremely low compared with, say, Western economies.
It's less than 40% of the economy is consumer spending, whereas the US is about 70%.
That's right. And there's probably a happy medium there somewhere. And Chinese efforts, this year alone, they've spent $50 billion on to try and incentivize the consumer by subsidizing, by trade-in schemes for everything from computers to electronic vehicles.
Yeah.
But the consumer's not particularly willing to unleash this spending way.
How much of the issue there is that so much saving in China takes the form of property, in the sense that it's rather difficult to, if you want to spend a bit on a new car, it's rather difficult to sell, 10% of a flat.
It is an issue. And I think it's because so much personal wealth is tied up in property. There have been many figures around, but by some it's maybe 2/3 or more. And so when that wealth is tied up in property and the property market is in such a bad way, and at the same time the social safety net in China is very weak, whether it's pensions or healthcare, for instance. And it's very difficult when you have that sense of insecurity, your biggest nest egg, your biggest investment continuing to decline, concerns over your future. It's very difficult then to persuade people to go out and start spending more money when they think they're going to need that money for further down the line. So you're left in a very stagnant situation.
And how much of an issue is the fact that the CCP seems to have closed off other avenues for investment or savings?
That's a big issue because it's a closed economy. So they theoretically, at least, Chinese people are quite heavily restricted as to the amount of money they can take out of the country. I think it's $50,000.
Yeah, that's there are some funny, creative ways of getting around that in the book.
There's a booming industry in ways to avoid that.
Yeah, you go to Macau, buy a watch and then immediately sell it back to the vendor, that sort of thing.
Yeah, the casinos of Macau are vast sort of money laundering enterprises in terms of, depending on your wealth, obviously you have access to different types of facilitators.
Yeah.
But getting money out of the country has become a huge industry in China in order to try and get around that. But it remains the case that your options for meaningful investment are very limited, which is why so much money is saved.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the CCP has attempted to try and deflate this bubble that they've in large part created through their policies. How did they go about that? And how did that go?
It went very badly. I mean, they tried. It's very hard to deflate a bubble without it running away with itself. And they sought to put limits on the amount of money which banks could lend for property purposes. This did have the effect of hammering the market. I think that the figures vary, but there is rarely a property developer which is solvent now in China. The biggest one, Evergrande, which was the world's biggest debtor, went out of business, was kicked off the Hong Kong Stock Exchange just a couple of weeks ago. Foreign bondholders are still scouring the world looking for assets they can grab.
Because presumably they're not going to be able to grab any in China.
Oh, yes, they're absolutely slim. So, the Communist Party is not going to, it's a lesson, really. And I think that a lot of more perceptive analysts have been warning for years about companies like Evergrande and the very, very dodgy balance sheets. But there was always this notion among foreign investors, well, they've always got the backstop is the party. The party's never going to let these companies go bust. And of course, money continued to flow to these companies, even though it made no sense. And now, of course, they're going bust. And unlike insolvency, bankruptcy in the West, you can't get your hands on assets which are in China because foreign bondholders are very, very low down the pecking order as far as the Communist Party is concerned, but wants to keep a lot of these companies on life support in order to at least complete some of the many millions of houses which they have been paid for by buyers, which have not been built.
Yeah, and also a really interesting aspect of the Chinese property market that is mentioned in your book, but I had no idea of, is in China, it's your property loses a lot of value if you rent it out, which must create some quite weird incentives.
Yeah, they prefer to leave them empty. I mean, at one point, China, the Communist Party claims that some of these cities are filling up. I'm skeptical, but there were ghost cities all over China, vast cities that have been built purely on speculation. But no one there. They had all the facilities, but no people.
Yeah.
And a lot of the apartments within these cities, I subsequently learned, had been sold, but they were sold entirely for speculation. And because there's a notion that if you rent them out, it will reduce the value, they were just left empty.
Yeah.
And hence you had the country littered with these ghost cities. Now, they claim that some of these are filling up. I'm skeptical. There are some examples where people have moved to, and that's more through coercion than voluntary movement, because they've placed certain facilities, whether they're educational or other, around those cities to try and persuade people to move there. But still, some of the figures are mind-boggling. If you combine the empty apartments in the ghost cities with the incomplete or apartments which are a victim of the property crash, some figures are as high as 100 million. And that's almost an apartment and a half for every member of the British population. These are incredible figures, and it does bring home to you just how difficult it's going to be, just what a ball and chain this is around the foot of the Chinese economy.
Yeah. Do you think the experience with Evergrande and other Chinese property developers going under will have a deterrent effect on Western investment into China?
That's a very good question, because I'm sometimes a bit puzzled by the dynamics of Western investment. There's long been a sense that in boardrooms across the West, the notion of the China market seems to suspend any rational consideration that would normally apply to other markets. Is this sense that we've really got to be there.
Yeah.
I mean, I recall
it's too big to ignore.
I recall meeting an American diplomat in Beijing who'd been down to Ningbo because an American diplomat in Beijing. He'd been down to Ningbo because a businessman had got into trouble down there. He had been hit by one of those little electric buggies that you see sometimes around the airport. And he was in hospital. And it turned out they'd taken away his passport until he paid for the damage to the buggy.
Right.
And so my diplomat friend was outraged, and he went down there wanting to sort of rattle cages. And I saw him when he came back, and I said, "Did you sort it?" And he said no. He said, "I got there, I found the guy in hospital, said, we'll get your passport back." And he told me to go away because he wanted to pay the fine. He wanted to pay for the damage because he had a business deal he was working on with the local government. And he was afraid that if he kicked up a fuss, he wouldn't get the business deal. And to me, that was an expression of some of the craziness at the time, that there was almost no indignity that business people were unwilling to endure for a slice of this mythical Chinese market. Yeah. In bars, among business people in Beijing, Shanghai, you would sometimes hear a relentless number of complaints about technology being being stolen. China's the world leader in cyber espionage of economic and industrial secrets and know-how, about forced transfer, about unfair competition, about all manner of threats, the lack of a level playing field. And whenever I had that conversation, I said, well, why are you here? To which the reply would be, oh, we've got to be in China. Now, I think that is beginning to change. I think people are becoming more aware. I think the geopolitics, there's always been a view among business people that we're not interested in geopolitics, but they're now realizing that geopolitics is interested in them. And more so now than ever. You can't escape it. And the conversations you're hearing about China are now about, well, when we look at our supply chains, it's less about where is cheapest. It's more about where is more resilient.
Yeah.
And you're looking, and there's a lot of skepticism about Xi Jinping's change of tone recently towards foreign investors, towards entrepreneurs. Can it possibly be for real, given that he spent the last 10 years turning China into a very unfriendly place for foreign investors and persecuting tech entrepreneurs? So there's a lot of skepticism about China. There's more wariness across the world about Chinese exports, especially cheap renewables, for instance, renewable tech, where there's been a vast overproduction in China.
Yeah.
So I detect the tone is changing, but in this sort of topsy-turvy geopolitics at the moment, Trump, tariffs, China, it's made it much more complicated for investors and economists looking to try and make firm decisions about China.
Yeah. Actually, on Trump tariffs, as you mention it, what's been the attitude among Chinese economists, say, to the effect of the supposed tariffs that we're going to get on China?
I think that there has been a bad effect. They have hit the economy, and you will be seeing those figures coming through. The figures at the moment, if you can believe them, are artificially inflated because of front end, because of people trying to get export,
to import.
Yeah, that's right, as to try and avoid anticipated tariffs. But China's is trying to portray itself as being highly resilient. One of the statistics, for instance, that you hear bandied about is that the US market now accounts for only about 15% of exports instead of 20% just a few years ago. Now, that's really, you have to be a little skeptical about that, because part and parcel of China's recent strategy has been to divert exports through third countries. Now you're seeing,
like Vietnam.
There's been a big increase. I mean, it was interesting to me when I went to Vietnam in researching the book, because I went there with this idea that here was Vietnam benefiting from supply chain diversification, and more people were going to Vietnam because it wasn't China. And but actually, there was a lot of Chinese companies going to Vietnam, and I thought, well, hello, are we saying Chinese companies are de-risking away from China? But actually, a lot of these companies were little more than assembly plants. So you had a lot of Chinese goods coming down from China through North Vietnam, the northern part of Vietnam, which is where they had these booming industrial estates. But some of these plants were little more than screwdriver factories. Some of them merely relabeling Chinese-made goods as made in Vietnam. So a lot of what we see as the apparent move away from the US market is actually more the diversion of goods through Vietnam, through Thailand, through Malaysia, Southeast Asia in particular. Those countries have become very wary. They don't want to get on Trump's radar as being facilitators of Chinese tariff dodging. But that is effectively what a lot of this adds up to. And those countries also worry about this undermining their own regional economy, Thailand being a very good example because of the impact of Chinese EVs and other motor-related companies.
Yeah, and Interesting, China also hasn't, over the last 10 years, been reluctant to introduce its own tariffs on countries that it feels have offended it in one way or another.
Oh,
Particularly, well, you can give some examples.
oh, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the ironies I find since the Trump's first tariffs back in April, with Xi Jinping standing up and criticizing bullying, coercion, presenting himself as a champion of, free trade and globalization. I mean, that's absurd.
Yeah.
The Chinese economy is built on coercion. China uses trade, investment, market access as means of coercion, as tools. It always has done it, and it always will do. So you can't get away from the fact that there's never been a level playing field in China for foreign companies. There have been multiple barriers put up to investment, and China has routinely used sanctions on exports, economic sanctions against companies which it perceives to have offended it,
though often to its own economic detriment. So I'm thinking particularly of the example of the restrictions imposed on, say, Australian coal.
Yeah, I mean, there are two examples really. One was in Lithuania, where tiny Lithuania, 3 million people, invited Taiwan to open a diplomatic office, an embassy in Vilnius under its own name, Taiwan,
rather than Taipei.
And so this caused outrage in Beijing, who imposed effective economic embargo on little Lithuania. When that didn't really work because the Lithuanians doubled down, they then tried to pressure multinational companies which traded in China but bought some inputs from Lithuania. Said, look, your business is going to suffer if you continue to buy from Lithuania. This in turn created outrage in Brussels, and arguably it was one of the key events that led to a hardening of attitudes in the EU towards China. Things have moved very fast since then, and we see now that the EU is increasingly outspoken in its criticism of Chinese trade practices. Australia demanded an investigation, not unreasonably, into the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. Outrage from Beijing, economic embargo against multiple Australian goods, including coal. Now, this coincided with issues with Chinese coal mines because of flooding and other production difficulties. And the Australian coal, while not a huge proportion of the Chinese market, was an important element of it because it was high quality coal. So you had this ridiculous situation where all these coal ships were floating around off China, but weren't allowed to come in. And you had industries grinding to a halt because they couldn't get enough energy. So it was an enormous example of self-harm. We've seen China react in multiple ways against companies that have criticized repression in Xinjiang, forced labor in Xinjiang, outrage, the imposition of sanctions against those companies, artificially created boycotts. Coercion as a tool, as an economic tool, has long been part of the Chinese playbook. So we have this sort of slight irony with Xi trying to sort of shapeshift somewhat
into a champion of free trade.
Yeah, which was absurd.
Yeah. And on Xi in particular, how would you sort of describe his economic outlook as distinct from previous Chinese leaders?
I think he is much more obsessed with security and control over economics. Now, I tend to, when I was writing the new foreword for Vampire State, I discovered this wonderful creature called the mimic octopus, which is much beloved of marine biologists because it's the world's greatest shapeshifter in that it can impersonate 15 different species, depending on the needs of the moment. If it wants to scare off a predator, it'll take on the appearance of a lionfish. If it wants to get a suitor, it will maybe impersonate a crab. And then when the suitor comes in, it'll poison it and devour it. Now, I think that this mimic octopus should be on the wall of the Zhongnanhai compound alongside the communist worthies, because I see the party very much as a shapeshifter over the years.
Yeah.
The biggest provocative, the biggest driver of reform and opening has been the survival of the party. It's the reason why China opened up in the first place, because the country was so demoralized and traumatized and impoverished after decades of Maoist madness, that the only way it could survive was through economic reform. And a lot of those reforms began spontaneously with the party playing catch up. And I think if you look over the years, the ebb and flow of reform has very much been a reflection of the party's sense of of paranoia, insecurity, its needs. You know, if when it's needed a certain technology company, whether it's Apple, Tesla, that the Communist Party gatekeeper, doorkeeper has opened the door up to them just wide enough to get in those it needs, shutting it quickly when it no longer needs them. So in a sense, you've had this process whereby the economy has been used, reformed, opened as and when needs be. But I think what defines Xi Jinping is more of an obsession with control, with security. The fact that is all that now comes first, more so than economic needs.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that analogy you have, that because it also holds, of course, for Deng Xiaoping, who you go into great detail on his early career in the book, where we tend to think of Deng Xiaoping as the man who opened up China to the West, who has this slightly apocryphal phrase about I don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, although I learned apparently it was actually black or yellow in this. But also, in the early 1950s, Deng Xiaoping was the party enforcer in southern China, and Mao was having to issue him instructions saying, execute fewer people because you're creating a labor shortage. So yeah, it's
he was an enthusiast about the purges. I mean, Deng Xiaoping was purged himself by Mao on 2 or 3 different occasions, but he was also an enforcer, and an enforcer with equal enthusiasm as Mao himself. I mean, he's no angel. I think that he reinvented himself, or more accurately, Western observers reinvented him. One of the observations often made about Deng is that he didn't like the idea of a cult of personality that we saw around Mao, didn't want to create one. But you could argue that Western observers created a cult of personality around Deng. They saw in him what they wanted to see, which was this plucky little reformer.
in the cowboy hat.
In the cowboy hat. This was this imagery of China opening up. I know as a young reporter in the early days I was covering China, news editors liked nothing more than stories about, China embracing capitalism, embracing, the West, and all. A lot of it was fairly superficial. A lot of it was transactional. A lot of it was opportunistic. And I think we completely lost sight that, in fact, Deng himself was not a political reformer at all. He saw the party as paramount over everything, party survival as paramount. He saw economic reform as a means to ensure that. And historically, he had been as big a thug as Mao.
Yeah.
But a lot of these things are sort of somewhat overlooked in a concentration on his reformist credentials.
But yeah, I suppose it is interesting, though, that the Communist Party did, for a period of about 30 years, depending on how you define it, see economic growth as a key element of their maintaining power. And under Xi Jinping, there seems to have been a shift away from that towards strength, security, that kind of thing. Do you think this was a this shift was a process of the product of a general shift within the Communist Party, or is it the product simply of Xi Jinping personally?
I think it's a combination. I think there's a lot of it is to do with Xi Jinping personally, with the sort of character he is, with the accumulation of power around him, abolishing term limits, abolishing what was a more collective leadership, imposing his own vision of how he sees China. I think it's also an expression of under Deng, one of the things you often heard was this notion of bide my time, hide my capabilities. And under Xi is very much, our time has come. If he has a defining ideology, it's one of the Chinese dream, which is the reinvigoration, the restoration of the great Chinese nation. It's parallel, if you like, to Putin's Ruski Mir, the Russian world. It's a very sort of imperialist notion. And of course, Taiwan being foremost in the mind of Xi Jinping. So I think it is Xi that has driven this more centralized approach, reasserting the role of the party in every aspect of life in China, after a period when the party was, if not peripheral, but not taken quite so seriously. I remember doing interviews at companies in China where they'd roll out the party boss of a particular plant, and he was often a bit of an embarrassment. And the people that ran the plant would sort of give you the sort of a perfunctory invitation to introduction to this guy.
Yeah.
And they were inevitably men, and then they'd shuffle them away as soon as possible, and they paid lip service to the party cell and to the party. But
they wanted to make it clear that this is not the man who's actually running anything.
Yeah, and now that's changed, whether it's in universities, whether it's in schools, whether it's in companies. They're all singing from the hymn sheet of the party. They're all proclaiming knowledge of Xi Jinping thought, a very amorphous thing though that is. But it's now compulsory in schools, in universities.
Yeah.
So this notion of the party reasserting itself, reasserting its authority, reasserting its control. And we've seen this and centralization of economic power back into Beijing. Less market-orientated, crackdown against entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs in recent years. Jack Ma, Bao Fan, big financier of tech companies who disappeared a couple of years ago, all of which make the more recent proclamations from Xi, his reaching out again to entrepreneurs in the market, seem a little bit superficial. But to answer your question, I do think it's something which you can identify closely with Xi. The party is an amorphous beast. Someone once said to me, a diplomat in Beijing, anybody who claims to understand the Chinese Communist Party is misinformed. It's an opaque organization, but Xi has sought to bring it tightly under his control with an anti-corruption campaign, the likes of which we haven't seen before in China. There have been anti-corruption campaigns, but not of that sort of scale, and not of the sort of the continuing manner in which it's taken part, and overtly political as well. Corruption has come to mean has come to
Xi Jinping.
Yeah, numerous different offences.
It's on corruption though. What was there a real problem, and does there continue to be a real issue in the Chinese economy?
There is. I mean, part of the problem is, while you can sympathise with the notion of getting corruption out of the system, your problem is when corruption is the system and there's no independent oversight. There's no, the police are party controlled. The courts are party controlled. The disciplinary system is within the party, which has its own secret network of prisons. So that it is ripe for for abuse.
Yeah.
And to me, it's become a system of musical chairs. So you move your opponents away because you don't trust them. But the next lot come in and are as equally as venal. But what determines whether you go after them is their political loyalty. And of course, we've seen really an institution that hasn't come under the spotlight of the anti-corruption police. Even the anti-corruption police themselves have been the subject of corruption investigations. More recently, it's been the military. We've seen a defense minister and a foreign minister. We've seen senior officials within the People's Liberation Army, the top echelons of the rocket force, which supposedly oversee those shiny missiles we saw on display in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square this week. This huge purge of the military, which then begs the question, of course, about how secure Xi is. Clearly, he feels the need to have this almost permanent purge going on, and what that means for his longevity.
Yeah. Is it indicative of him having no real opposition and so he can do what he likes? Or is it indicative that he's very insecure?
Exactly. And you can make both of those points. You can argue that this tells you that he's got no opposition anymore. If there's the slightest hint of it, they're going to be crushed.
Yeah.
And does this mean we have a man at the height of his power?
Yeah.
Or does this mean that we have a deeply paranoid leader with multiple opponents around him, playing a sort of game of whack-a-mole to try and get rid of these as soon as they appear to be anything less than loyal?
Yeah.
And I remember having a conversation with Ai Weiwei, the dissident Chinese artist at his home in Lisbon. And I asked him this very question about the power of Xi Jinping. And he pointed out to me, he said that historically, Chinese emperors have been at their most vulnerable when they've appeared to be at their strongest.
Yeah. Sort of sense of hubris, and well, we've heard the hot mic incident just last week between Xi and Putin talking about immortality, and potential for sort of research in that direction. We've talked a lot about Xi Jinping and the Communist Party and its sort of extremely distortive effects on the Chinese economy. Perhaps from a slightly higher level, what role does China's demographics have on its kind of economic prospects in the future, given that it has a population that's rapidly aging? You have very low birth rates compared to where it has been sort of half a century ago. Is that going to have serious impacts on China's ability to sustain growth long term?
I think it will have very serious impacts. I mean, China boosters would argue that, well, robots, other technical innovations will help to soften the blow. But certainly the demographic crisis that China faces is arguably far worse than, birth rates are falling everywhere, especially in Northeast Asia. But China's problems have been exacerbated by the one-child policy over the years, forcing women to have a single child, which has had a devastating effect on demographics. Now, of course, they're going to the other extreme and trying to force or coerce women into having 2 or 3 babies. And it's very, to me, it's ironic that the hated family planning bureaucracy, which enforced this brutal one-child policy for so many years, is now the same bureaucracy that's ringing up young women and asking, well, have you thought about having another child? And they don't, the Communist Party leadership, which is overwhelmingly male, of course, doesn't really get that women are making a choice about having just one child or no child at all now. So you've moved from this coercive system to try and force women to have a single child to employing the same bureaucracy to try and pressure women to have multiple children. And it's just not going to work. And I think in the Chinese context, but the irony at the moment, of course, is you have this massive youth unemployment, which it hit a couple of years ago. It hit 20%, and then they changed the way they did the figures.
So went down to like 11%.
Surprise, it fell down. But even under the revised way of measuring it, it's now back up to 16 or 17%.
Right.
And going back,
What's driving this?
I think it's more of a mismatch because it's graduates coming out of university and there simply aren't the jobs for them in these urban areas. But the difficulty I think the party faces is, and we touched upon it earlier, in a system where legitimacy is not based on democratic election, so performance legitimacy. So they say we bring stability, we bring economic growth.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're the technocrats that should be running this country. What happens, therefore, when this kind of unwritten deal starts to unravel and you're not delivering the rates of economic growth that have taken place before, that there are heady levels of unemployment among young people, among graduates? Does this deal then start to fall apart, and what that might mean for stability within China? And I think that is also a factor which is affecting the party's conception of imposing itself and the security apparatus more broadly in China. The surveillance state, gearing up the surveillance state in a way that we haven't seen anywhere else in the world. This paranoia about instability and what might happen if people become less than happy with the way the party is running things.
Yeah. If you undermine the sort of foundations of your legitimacy, you have to resort to repression as the alternative.
Yeah, and repression under Xi has been far worse than under his predecessors. Whether that's in Xinjiang, Tibet, or against ordinary Chinese people, the elbow room for discussion has been rapidly narrowed. In a quite chilling way.
Okay. So, as a sort of final question, you have a whole chapter in the book on Chinese football and the not terribly successful attempts to turn China into a leading football nation. Why did this happen, and what does it tell us anything more broadly about sort of Xi Jinping era mission-directed government?
I think it's a wonderful analogy about innovation. Now, it might seem a bit churlish to say that ask whether China can innovate, because there's a lot of quite creative tech companies, technologies, whether it's the humanoid robots we've seen a lot of recently, to AI, but
EV vehicles,
but there's a difference between re-innovation and fast following, and basic innovation. China's excelled at applied innovation, developing and finding uses for technology and ideas that have been acquired by every available means, including wholesale theft. But it's less good at the basic research of fundamental innovation, which is a key to creating a sort of innovation-driven economy. And the reason I went to football, because I thought football was a marvelous example of something which is bottom-up rather than top-down. It's a creative sport. And 10 years ago, Xi Jinping instituted this plan to turn China into a football superpower. It's, the ultimate soft power. And he decreed that there would be certain targets, including whether it was the recruitment of coaches, the building of football pitches, a date by which China would dominate Asian football, a date by which it wanted to host the World Cup and become a world power. This plan had all the thrills of a pork pan plan or a steel plan, state directed. He persuaded companies, mainly property companies, to invest vast amounts in support of this project. One result was a major distortion of the world transfer market as Chinese clubs grabbed stars from around the world. bought clubs, including several in the UK. I invested in Manchester City, for instance, Southampton, Aston Villa, bought both the Milan teams. The amount of money that went into it was mind-boggling. Now, when China began this process, they were 81st in the world, according to FIFA. When I last checked, they were 87th. Now, but what they did achieve was a world-class standard of corruption. And the number of footballers, almost the entire hierarchy of the Chinese Football Association, all collared for corruption. Huge waste, huge corruption, and no real difference to the performance on the field. I look at that and I look at innovation, and I ask myself whether real innovation can succeed in a society where the party wants to be in every classroom, wants to be in every laboratory, wants to be in every boardroom. Is that really conducive to creating? Because traditionally, if we look at our own societies, innovation has tended to thrive in the atmosphere of critical thinking, open environments. And can you really create innovation top down by diktat? Even if you have the vast amounts of money they clearly do have to throw at this, can that really succeed in creating this innovation-driven economy, which China claims is its aim, this high-quality growth that Xi bangs on about a lot? And I really have my doubts. I mean, yes, innovation sometimes thrives in adversity, and you've seen quite impressive progress by Huawei in creating chips, still well short of what Taiwan or the West has, but because they're facing sanctions and restrictions on access to Western microprocessors, it's encouraging them to come up with some homegrown solutions. So yes, adversity can be a driver to innovation, but I have my doubts about whether, when you look at the spark, the ingenuity, the mavericks, the sort of people who drive innovation. And I look at China, I look at the party, I look at the grey men surrounding Xi, and I wonder, can that system really develop the sort of innovation-driven economy that it claims to want?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, a really, really interesting point, an interesting thought, and a very interesting book. I think we're at about up against time, so I think we'll call it a day there. But thank you to everyone who has listened to this. Do remember to subscribe, like, give us 5 stars if you've enjoyed it. Also, do buy a copy of Vampire State, which is available in all good bookshops now, and we'll include a link in the description. But until next time, thank you for listening.